Fortunate to be the first group to see a PowerPoint presentation based on a great new book, TV Land Detroit. Many of television's characters that you'll see in this book, both fictional, of course it was the characters that played them, and real, lived in the Grosse Pointe community over the years. Any of you that know me know that my father worked at WJBK radio and television for almost 40 years. And so this is a subject that's near and dear to me, but I can remember Christmas parties in the studio at 2nd and Bethune, where Channel 56 is now, and we thought nothing of Wood Brother Woodsman or Morgus, the crazy scientist, or anything showing up, and to me it was normal to meet and know a lot of these people, at least if they were on Channel 2 anyway. Tonight's speaker, Gordon Castelnero, has a great background in TV, radio, and video. Most of it was here in Metro Detroit. He grew up in Livonia, where his interest in local TV started at a young age. His first year of college was at Schoolcraft College in their criminal justice program, and he quickly realized that this was not the curriculum for him, and transferred to Henry Ford Community College to attend their TV and film program. After a year at that institution, he transferred to Cal State Long Beach to pursue an interest in television and film programming close to the source of much of it. While in Southern California, he worked as an intern at Cenex, is that right? That's Cenex Casting, a division of Central Casting, where he looked forward to becoming a producer or director. In the summer of 1988, while home on a break from college, he worked at my employer, Technicolor Video Services. And you may know that the very first place to put a movie on videotape was in Farmington Hills, a company called Magnetic Video. There was 100,000 VCRs in the country. They were later acquired by CBS, and then Fox bought half of the CBS Fox until it was sold in 1987 to Technicolor. 2 weeks before his graduation from college in 1990, and correct me please, Gordon, if any of this is incorrect, this is from an interview before this, he received a job offer from Aaron Spelling Productions as a $7 an hour film runner. And even at that time, I can remember going to LA a couple times a year for Technicolor, and it was quite expensive out there. But at the time, they were putting together the crew for the new program, Beverly Hills 90210, and the gentleman who offered him the job told him if he could not commit to start immediately, he wouldn't be any good to him in 2 weeks. And Gordon decided he was going to graduate and turned down the offer. Unfortunately, this is the only film industry offer he had while in Los Angeles. Moving back to Detroit, he took a job with Health Career Learning Systems, where he worked for 18 months as an office manager and as their HR rep. I remember you saying, I was just in HR. Of course, I've been an HR director for 20 years, so I thought it was more important than that. just give him a hard time. In 1992, he joined the staff of WNIC's morning crew on the Harper Gannon show, and there he worked for 4 years in a part-time job that would often entail 60-hour weeks. While he was the voice of a couple of the show's characters, his primary thrust was all of the station's promos and program editing. In 1996, he completed his first documentary, Michigan, and started here. But unable to find a station that would fund it, he completed it himself, and after it was finished, it was picked up by Channel 4 and recut to become a 30-minute show meant to showcase the new member of their staff, Devin Skilling. It ran on Channel 4. Boy, and you had all these things memorized too. It's great. September, yeah, I mean, it was Saturday, December 7th, 1996 at 7 p.m. Received an amazing 11.5 rating and was nominated for an Emmy. Unable to turn this into a reoccurring series, though, it was re-edited into a program for Channel 56 entitled, of course, PBS, Detroit, Michigan, and the American Dream, which included some footage from the Channel 4 program, but was now an hour in length. PBS program would include the stories of magnetic video, the world's first videotape duplication operation for consumer use, and many other stories about things that started in Detroit. On August 23rd of 1999, his third documentary, Titanic, the final chapter, appeared on Channel 4 at 8 p.m. against ABC's Monday Night Football. This program won Gordon his first local Emmy, and in 1998, Gordon joined Technicolor as their vault coordinator, a job that he held until last year. As I mentioned, this was the successor to magnetic video. Unfortunately, that duplication plant, the world's largest, which I can remember when I started there in 1984, being in charge of duplication on the midnight shift and getting a telegram from New York thanking us for doing 15,000 video cassettes, was doing 550,000 a day, 7 days a week at its peak in the early 90s, but unfortunately closed March 31st of 2006. Before the closure, though, Gordon transferred to Technicolor's remaining operation in Metro Detroit, its distribution services department, where he continues to work today. 2004 discussion with a fellow staffer of ours, Frank Gadwell, led to a discussion about all the things that have disappeared in Detroit, and the conversation turned a local TV program that has all but disappeared over over the past quarter century. This struck him as part of a local pop culture and a story that had not been told. Generation Xer, born in 1965, Gordon is not really old enough to know firsthand some of the characters in his book, but he did interview Larry Gillespie, who was a 30-year legend, or was a 30-year legend at Technicolor and an expert on the topic, and many of the people featured in the book. After a tough culling of the local programs, he settled on the 25 shows that he felt best represented local shows from the 1950s to 1980s. Well, enough on Gordon. Let's hear about the book. These are PowerPoint images of all of the pictures of the book.
That's correct. They're all the photos that are in the book.
Good.
Well, I'd just like to start out by saying thank you all for coming and listening to what I have to say about TV Land Detroit. This was a great labor of love for me. It's a 330-page tribute to all of the local shows that are very dear to our hearts, and I think all of us carry a piece of Detroit television with us. And this was a project, too, that I was able to complete in a record 10 months. I spent 6 months interviewing all the folks who were involved with Detroit television, in front of the camera, the surviving program talent, the behind-the-scenes folks, and then, of course, some hardcore fans at home. I really wanted to give everyone a complete sense of what these shows were all the way around, everything from the conception of the shows to jokes that ran amok on the set, the demise of the shows, and the impact that they had, because they really shared an intimacy with the community that I think is lost, that local television really doesn't have today. So, as Mike had said, I wanted to do what was representative of the golden age. There is no real official golden age of Detroit television, so the way I looked at it was starting from the 50s on to the 80s, and I started with 1953. Local television goes back to 1947, but the reason that I had started with 1953 was because that's when this gentleman arrived. And I'm sure probably a lot of folks here used to run home from school at lunchtime so they could sit down and have lunch with Sufi, tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwich, and sharing all of his crazy antics. Sufi came to Detroit in 1953. He was looking to get into a bigger market. He was a disc jockey and a stand-up comic in Cleveland, Ohio. He's originally from North Carolina. That's where he was born, and he grew up in West Virginia. But he was looking to get into a bigger market in 1953. And Detroit, at one time during the 50s, was the fourth largest market for television in the country. So it was a huge step for him. And right about the time that he was looking to come to Detroit, Channel 7 was looking to do a show called 12 O'Clock Comics. It was a wraparound show. And basically it was a wraparound shows featured like cartoons and other like little short films, Laurel and Hardy, Three Stooges shorts, things like that. And then they would have live action that was produced locally wrapped around those features. So a guy by the name of John F. Pivel, who was the vice president and general manager at WXYZ, was looking to do this children's show that would feature the host who would have lunch with all of the kids. So Sufi came and he auditioned for it, and what's interesting too is John Pivel had actually seen Sufi once before in Cincinnati when Sufi was doing his nightclub act, so it was almost like a little bit of a reunion there. But Sufi was doing a rehearsal. He was kind of just doing his practice routine, what he was going to audition for, and everybody there at the station thought that was his audition, so they hired him based on that. But what's interesting too is that Sufi was using the name Sufi Hines. Now his real name is Milton Suppman, and he got the name Sufi. It was a nickname given to him by the kids that he grew up with because they all thought his last name was Soupman, so they just called him Sufi. And when he was in Cleveland, he had a sponsor, Heinz Soup, so he used the name Heinz at that time. Well, John Pivel didn't like him using the last name Heinz because he thought that people would confuse it with Heinz ketchup. So For a while there, Sufi didn't have a name, or a last name. It was just Sufi, but people kind of wrote in and they wanted to know, what's this Sufi guy's last name? So Pievel came up with the idea of giving him the last name of Sales, and it was actually after a stand-up, or a silent film comic by the name of Chick Sale, and then Pievel added the S on it because he thought that would engender sales. So therefore you have Sufi Sales, and the name stuck with him. When Sufi came, he was a very young man at the time. The costume that you see him, which he's very well known for, the V-neck sweater and the oversized bow tie and the top hat, that was all given to him right here at Channel 7. In fact, when he went on to become a huge star on a national level, everything that was used and created at Channel 7, went with him. So really Detroit, the Detroit baby boomers, were the very first to enjoy all of that Sufi had to offer in the way of humor, the uniqueness of his set. I'm sure a lot of people probably remember whenever there was a knock at the door, you never knew what was going to be there. There would be, either like an old clip of something like a guy walking an elephant, or acrobats, circus acrobats, or a lot of times there would just be a set of hands, and you never saw who those hands belonged to. Those belonged to a guy by the name of Clyde Adler. And Clyde Adler became Sufi's right-hand man, and Clyde was a stagehand at Channel 7. And the way Clyde really kind of made his mark was Sufi had wanted a character named White Fang, and it was an idea that he had back when he was in the Navy. And he had heard a record of the Hound of the Baskervilles, and the dog bark that was in there. When he heard that, he's like, there's my White Fang. So White Fang was originally heard on a record, but one day when they were going to cue White Fang, they couldn't find the record. The record was gone. So Clyde, being the improvisational person that he was, he just went up by the camera and started going, and it stuck. I mean, Sufi loved it, and then later on, another stagehand's wife cut up an old coat, and it became the paw that you always saw that just went in front of the camera, but you never saw the rest of the dog. And then later on, Sufi was advised, maybe you should have an opposite for White Fang. Since White Fang was the meanest dog in Detroit, then maybe you should have, the sweetest dog, and that became, Blacktooth. And then, of course, we probably all remember Boogie the Lion there. And that's an interesting story in itself, because Pookie, the original Pookie, was a Charlemagne the Lion. There was a puppeteer by the name of Bill Laird who was known nationally, and he had this puppet, Charlemagne the Lion. So Sufi was using it, but unfortunately Charlemagne the Lion was copyrighted. So Sufi went to New York and went to see a sculptor that he knew and said, can you make enough changes on this puppet so we don't infringe copyright? And so he paid a lot of money to have this done, and that became the Pookie that you see there. And you probably all remember too the way Pookie would make his entrance. He'd want a story read to him, and a lot of times he came on during like a Frank Sinatra rendition of that song, Fairy Tales Can Come True, It Can Happen to You If You're Young at Heart, and he'd have a little fedora hat on. And then when Sufi would read the story, Pookie would start doing antics behind Sufi, and every time Sufi turned around, all of a sudden, Pookie would become real docile, just like he was paying attention to Sufi. There was also another character on there too that you remember named Hippie the Hippo. And Hippie was a Charlemagne the Lion puppet turned inside out. Jack Flexick, who was the art director over at Channel 7, was very instrumental in creating the set that you saw, the clubhouse. Sufi had an idea what he wanted for a clubhouse, but it was Jack Flexick who really embellished it and created that famous clubhouse. And Jack also, when he took the Charlemagne the Lion puppet and turned it inside out, he says, wow, this looks like a hippopotamus. So that became Hippie the Hippo. And then, of course, there was Willie the Worm, the sickest worm in all of Detroit, who did the birthdays. And Willie the Worm was this little exotic worm that Sufi bought for 35 cents at Woolworths. And this worm always kept coming apart, so Jack Flexick would always have to mend it back together. And so then Jack went and got the only other little worm that Woolworths had, and that became Willie. So you had the two little worms that were interchangeable, but they would always come apart. So, the great thing about like a show like Sufi's too is just the looseness of the set. There was always laughter to be heard. You'd always hear the crew people laugh, and that's basically because Sufi was very insistent that he get some laughs, because that's the only way he knew if something was funny. And he would absolutely hate television the way it is today, because television, they don't have crew people in the studios anymore. It's all automated cameras. And the former director at WXYZ, Mason Weaver, who has since died before the book actually came out, he was the one who actually told me, Sufi would absolutely hate this, the way television is today. But interestingly enough, when I had spoken to Sufi about that, he had said that there was one time when he was in New York that he wasn't getting any laughs. He was doing his show, and then all of a sudden there was just no laughter from the crew. And he's like, what's wrong? Isn't this material funny at all? And the crew said, oh yeah, absolutely, it's funny, but we were told we can't laugh because they don't want these laughs going out over the air. And he said, well, this is ridiculous. So he went to the management and the network and told them, said, I want them to laugh, or the show is over, because it's the only way I know anything is funny. And of course, one of his biggest gags certainly was the pie in the face that everybody remembers. And then he's also in the doorway there, you can see just a smidgen of the little cork hole. It said, do not touch, where sometimes just out of curiosity, he would go and he would pull that cork out, and then you'd be squirted in the water with face, or there'd be a lot of foam cream that would come out. But the great thing too is his humor. A lot of people probably remember the typical Sufi gags. One of his bits that you may remember very fondly was, as he was doing his show, there was a mouse that ran across the floor, and so Sufi wanted to catch the mouse. So he doesn't have a mouse trap. He doesn't have, or I take it back, he did have a mouse trap, but he didn't have any bait. He looks in his refrigerator, he has no cheese, pulls the insides of his pockets out, he's got no money. So what's he going to do? How's he going to catch this mouse? So the way he does it was, he goes and he looks at a magazine, finds a picture of some cheese, and he cuts that out, he puts it in the mouse trap. Then he goes on with the show. And as he's going on with the show, all of a sudden you hear snap. And it's like, I got the mouse. So then he goes and he picks up the mouse trap, and inside it is a picture of a mouse. So typical Sufi humor, and of course, the pies in the face, that was something that he always enjoyed, because he was a fan of silent movies, and he liked pie fights. And he inserted a gunshot in there to make it funnier, so that way the impact was a little bit greater. But he became so well known, obviously, for the pies in the face, that when he did go national, celebrities were lining up to get pies in the face. Frank Sinatra was dying to be on his show to get a pie in the face. So that's something that was pioneered here in Detroit. And this is one of my favorite pictures in the book. In fact, my book is the only place where you'll see this photo, because I got this directly from the photographer who took it. His name was Jim Bergen. He was an engineer at Channel 7, and he was also a cameraman on Sufi's show. And this photograph was taken in 1955, and Sufi with all of his bird baths. You probably remember being called bird baths. And there was never any real logic to why he came up with that. He just wanted to do something that was a little different. And he figured if he called people bird baths, then it would be kind of like a big guess, like, what's he talking about? What's he trying to talk about? But, it was a gimmick that he devised for no real reason. And of course, there was the Bird Bath Club. And people such as Channel 7's Eric Smith had confessed that he was proud to be a bird bath. So this photo actually too was an old three-dimensional. If you remember, those were popular back in the 50s, and even in my childhood, in the late 60s and early 70s, you had three-dimensionals, and so I had this reproduced as a photo, and I thought it'd be a great addition to the book. But Sufi Sales is by far the biggest star that has come out of Detroit TV, and then of course, His show was one of many shows that had a lot of backstage gags. They would spike his food all the time. They would put salt in his cereal. They would put vodka in his juice. And, just to see his reaction, boy, that was good. And also, too, you probably remember that the food had a lot of sound effects to it. Whenever he bit into a hamburger, you'd hear a cow go moo. Whenever he had a chicken, you'd hear the bok, 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 bok. When he'd have Jell-O and he'd shimmy it, you'd hear bun, 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 bun. So they one time, too, with his Jell-O, actually, and this was a precursor to a very famous gag that was on his show that a lot of people know about. They carved his Jell-O in the shape of a naked woman. So the breasts were so lifelike that when you shimmied it, they would go back and forth, and it just broke Sufi up. And of course, that led on to the famous naked lady that came to the door. But again, Sufi Sales, a Detroit original. He was here until 1960 when he made the deal with the ABC network. He also, during this time too, had a nighttime show called Sufi's On, which was for the adults, because this was a show that was for kids. But it was also the very first really big show that transcended all audiences, because you had kids watching it, you had adolescents watching it, particularly adolescents doing the Sufi Shuffle. We really thought they had something by being able to do that. And then you also had adults watching it. So that's why this is really the beginning of the golden age of Detroit TV. And then, of course, there were other children's shows, too. And you probably remember this guy, Captain Jolly. And Captain Jolly showcased Popeye cartoons. This was a show that came from the other side of the border at CKLW. And they had bought a Popeye cartoon package, and they were looking for a wraparound to showcase the Popeye cartoons. And so Toby David, who was very, very big in radio, incidentally, a lot of people don't know this, but he was probably our first Arab American who was on television, local television that is, because his parents were immigrants from Lebanon. And Toby David was very big in radio. He was known as the man of 1,000 voices, because one of the things that he used to do was he used to read the funny papers. And he would do all of the character voices, and he used to do this every week. He'd read everything in the Sunday comics, and he would do all the voices. In fact, Disney wanted him to be their voice, to do all the voices just like what Warner Brothers did with Mel Blanc. But unfortunately, Toby had developed polyps on his throat, and he was told by the doctor, hey, you can't do all these voices anymore, otherwise you'll lose your voice. So when he auditioned for Captain Jolly, he did his German accent because it was one that was very easy for him to do, and it didn't strain his voice. And there you see him on the dock where you never saw his ship, you never really knew where he was. And he's there with some of his characters, and Captain Jolly was a sketch that you watched Monday through Friday. And it was for the smaller kids, and one of his puppets, Finny the Fish, used to squirt water in Captain Jolly's face all the time. But he would do little skits where, like one skit that he did was he found this can and it had the letters on it. It had like S and a P and an O, and you didn't know what the other letter was. So some people thought maybe it would be soup, but it turned out to be soap, and that was revealed at the end. But on the weekends, because the Popeye cartoons ran 7 days a week, on the weekends, you got this guy, Kutek Paul. And Kutek Paul was a little bit more energetic than Captain Jolly, and Kutek Paul would do things outside a lot. He would have go-kart races, hula hoop contests, roller skating races, and a lot of people remember his Beatle lip sync contests that he used to do, and they were very bad lip sync contests, but that's the charm of the show. But Kutek Paul, his real name was Paul Allen Schultz, and he was the weatherman there at Channel 9. And again, you never saw the ship that he was on, or never really knew exactly what port he was at, but he was the weekend wraparound, and he got a bigger set too than Captain Jolly did. And that was just because at the TV station at Channel 9, during the week when they would run the news, the news had the bigger set. And so Captain Jolly had to have a small one, but then on the weekends when they weren't running the news, they let Kutek Paul have it. So you got to actually have an audience on the show. Kids could actually be on there, whereas on Captain Jolly they couldn't. Another popular children's show was Jingles in Boofland. Does anybody here remember the Boofland loyalty song? Yeah, there you go. Boofland by Boofland. Do you remember the opening way above the Ishkabal and over the Foofran Sea? There's a magical kingdom where Jingles will be, or something like that. But anyway, this is a show that came to the Detroit market from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And Jerry Booth, who's featured there as Jingles, him and Larry Sands. Larry Sands was the puppeteer, and Larry Sands, in a lot of ways, was the real brains behind the show, because he's the one who developed a lot of the skits and the characters. Jingles, again, was a wraparound around cartoons. But those two characters there that you see him with were Cecil B. Rabbit and Herkimer Dragon. And of course, Cecil B. Rabbit was the world's greatest anything. His title was Cecil B. Rabbit, WGA, which was world's greatest anything. And he was an authority on, he was the best at everything. He was the best singer, the best dancer, the best movie director, and best actor, and so forth. And in fact, some of the outrageous bits that they did, Cecil B. always claimed to know all the Hollywood stars on a first-name basis. In fact, there's one episode where he claimed that Marlon Brando stole the script from him. So he also used to come in too and do the news. And his news was patterned after Paul Harvey, because Larry Sands was a big Paul Harvey fan. And so when Cecil B. would come in, he'd say, "Good evening, Booflandians. It's time for news. Page 1. And then he would go into it. But Cecil B. was always trying to get Jingles in trouble. And then, of course, at the opposite end, you had Herkimer Dragon, who was kind of a dumbly character, but who would always kind of enter the show, "Hey, Jing, buddy." And so he was the good character, the good puppet, where Cecil B. was the heavy. And if you look closely at them, you can see that those puppets are paper mache. And that's because when the show was first developed in Indiana, they didn't have any money to create these puppets. So they knew a guy who could make things out of paper mache, so he had them, or they had him construct these puppets out of paper mache. And it's interesting, you can look at it now and say, boy, these look really cheap and cheesy, but through the eyes of a child, they created a lot of endearing memories. In fact, just to tell you how powerful they were, if you look at this photo here, this was an old advertisement, and you can see where Herkimer said that he didn't have a hat because Cecil B. had a hat on a particular show. Jingles there has his own little hat, but Herkimer felt left out. So when he made the comment that he didn't have a hat, all of a sudden they got flooded with all kinds of mail and people sending hats to him. So again, that just goes to show you the power that these local shows had. So Jingles again was a brilliant children's show, and also too on at the same time, if you watch Channel 7 at I believe it was 5 o'clock when Jingles aired. So if you watched Channel 7 at that time, you saw this gentleman, Johnny Ginger. And Johnny Ginger started there in the late 50s. A guy by the name of Pete Strand, who was the program director at Channel 7, was touring the nightclubs, and he was looking for different comics to do a wraparound show that they were developing around the Three Stooges shorts, because they had acquired the Three Stooges shorts. And the program was called Curtain Time Theater, and Johnny Ginger was known for his squeaky clean comedy. And so he was chosen to audition among many. In fact, when he got there, they said, "Johnny Ginger, you're 26. I may be a little off on the numbers. It's been a while since I've looked at my notes, but they said, Johnny Ginger, 28. I think that was at 28. And he said, or no, it was Jerry Gale, that was the name he was using at the time. And so they said, Jerry Gale, 28. And he says, no, I'm 26 or 24 or something like that. And they said, no, you're 28 in line. So he thought, oh boy, here I was being asked to come and audition. I thought I had it, and it turns out I had to audition for it with 28 or 26 or 7 other people. But anyway, he got the job based on one little thing that he did, which was when he first came on the stage, they said, whatever you have prepared, forget it. We want you to just improvise right now. So there was just a stool there, so he sat on the stool and he rocked back and forth, and he fell off and he flipped himself over, and then got up and went, da, and that got him the show, because they said, we love what you did, that physical thing, because it reminded us of Buster Keaton. So also too, when the show went into production, they had no set for the show. They had no set, no costume, really no clue on what they were doing for this curtain time theater. So he was given a set of overalls that were found in a locker, that Ivy League cap that was found in the prop room, and they gave him a little corner in the backstage area behind the studio, and they said, okay, this is your set. So Johnny decided, well, since this is curtain time theater, I'll just be a stagehand and I'll be the curtain puller. And he became this lovable character that very much like Sufi, where Sufi was a very lovable loser, I guess you could say, because he never wanted anything, and he was always the victim of whatever scam was going on, and everybody beat him at anything that he did. Well, with Johnny's stagehand character, he did the same thing. And Johnny, one of the things too that he did was he did voices, because he didn't have puppets like the other shows. And so what he was a real master at was timing and doing voices. And what I mean by that was he would tape record voices. 2 characters that he did, which were Killer, who sounded very much like Jerry Lewis. Gee, Johnny, can you come out and play today? Mr. Rocky won't find out about it. And then there was Mr. Rocky, who was his boss, who had this other voice that was kind of like, oh, you better get back to work or you're fired. So Johnny would pre-record those voices, and he would leave little holes in the tape to where he would interact with them. And I mean, the timing on something like that is everything, because if you're just a second off, it blows the whole gag. But he became this sad sack character where everything happened to him. Sandbags fell on him and things like that. But he became very, very popular. He was the next biggest banana at Channel 7, next to Sufi. But in 1960, something very interesting happened. Pete Strand had seen a movie called The Bellboy with Jerry Lewis. And it was a very popular movie at the time. And Pete Strand decided, I want Johnny Ginger to be a bellboy just like Jerry Lewis was. And so then they all of a sudden the station came up with all this money to build this set. And they built this hotel lobby that became the Rocky Plaza Hotel. And all of a sudden Johnny there was a bellboy. And Johnny was pretty upset about that too, because he said, everybody loves this stagehand character, now you killed it. You absolutely killed this character, and now I'm this bellboy, nobody knows what the heck I'm doing. And so to kind of embellish on that a little bit, what he did was he said, this bellboy character is just my front. I'm really a spy, I'm a secret agent. So that allowed him the versatility to do all kinds of different bits. And he did things outdoors too, in the backyard at Broadcast House. He did like Western scenes. He skydived, he wrestled a midget. I mean, he did all kinds of goofy things, but a lot of physical humor on his show. But that's what a lot of people remember him too as the bellboy, and that's what he was for the most part during his tenure at Channel 7. He also got the name Johnny Ginger. I want to back up a little bit on that one, because he was using the name Jerry Gale at the time when he auditioned there. And the same man who gave Sufi the name of Sales gave him the name Johnny Ginger. When Jerry Gale got the job to do this curtain time theater, he was summoned to John Pybel's office, and he showed up there, and John Pybel said, "Johnny Ginger, come on in." And so Jerry Gale looks around and he says, "Johnny who?" And he's like, you, Johnny Ginger, come on in." And he says, well, where'd you get that name? You know, it's kind of a silly sounding name. And John Pivel says, well, you know, in all the children's stories, there's always a Johnny character. You know, little Johnny went to school, you know, Johnny went out to play, etc. And then after he went into this philosophical reason why, all of a sudden he said, well, I must confess, actually I took the name off a bottle of beer. Because there used to be this beer called Johnny Bull Ginger Beer. And embossed on the bottle, and it was a little green bottle too, said Johnny Bull Ginger Beer, but Johnny appeared right over Ginger. And Pivel liked the way that looked, and he said, that's going to be your name. And of course, Johnny's response was, well, I'm glad it was that and not a bottle of Budweiser, otherwise my name would have been Budweiser. But in the late 60s, of course, like a lot of the shows that started in the 50s, the ratings were declining, so Johnny ended up leaving Channel 7, but then came back to Channel 50 at the time for a show that they were doing that was a wraparound. And the show actually had been in progress for a while. It was called Captain Detroit. And Johnny became the next captain of Detroit, a guy by the name of Bill Murray, not the famous Bill Murray, but a local Bill Murray, was the original Captain Detroit, and then Johnny became the next one. And then when he did it for a short bit, then Tom Ryan, who everyone knows on WOMC radio, was doing a character called Sergeant Sacto, and then took that over, and that became the show. Moving on a little bit, I had said that Johnny Ginger was a squeaky clean comic. This guy, on the other hand, if some of you recognize him, was not. This is a gentleman by the name of Marv Welch. I don't know if you folks know that name, but Marv Welch was very much a forerunner to like a Lenny Bruce or an Andrew Dice Clay. He was a very filthy, potty-mouthed comedian back in the 50s. Back in those days, they used to call it blue humor. So when he was asked to do this children's show on Channel 7, a lot of people were very put off by that at the station. They were shocked because they're like, you know, you're having this filthy-mouthed comedian do a children's show? And this was a show for the real little kids, too. It was a show that taught them the alphabet, and they decided they wanted the main character to be this pixie that they called Wixie, which was a play on WXYZ. Of course, what's interesting was when they were looking for a title for the show, there was this meeting in John Pivel's office with Marv Welch, and Marv said, well, you know, Fred Wolf on Wixie Radio has a show called Wixie Wonderland. Too bad we can't use that. And then John Pivel said, the hell we can't. You're going to be Wixie Wonderland. So they kind of basically stole the name, and in 1953 this show premiered. And Marv Welch was a guy who looked a lot like Danny Kaye. He would come out and he would do lip syncs to a lot of records. He recorded a lot of records too. It's something that he did on the weekends. And the show also featured a cast of characters that were all diverse. One was a clown called Gee Whiz, and the reason why it was called Gee Whiz, and that was this gentleman here, was because this guy, his name was Ken Muse, and he could draw very, very fast. And what he would do is he would play a record, and then as the record was playing, he would draw the sleeve of the record. He would draw it live on television, and he would have the whole thing drawn before the record ran out. And Marv said, gee whiz, he's the fastest there is. And that's how he got that name. There was also a character on there called Gramps, who used to read stories to the children. And then there was a piano player by the name of Diane Dale who sang songs. So you had this little ensemble that catered to the little kids. And this was a show that aired early in the morning at 7 a.m. In fact, what's interesting too is Marv Welch, working the nightclubs at night, he often came to the show directly from a club. So it was always interesting how he was able to pull it together. But another real interesting point about this show was right after it aired, all of a sudden Channel 7 decided to pull the plug on it for whatever reason. And when they did, they got this big outpour of letters that just flooded the station from all these angry mothers saying, put that show back on the air, put that show back on the air. And because they got such a huge demand from mothers, that they said, okay, we made a mistake, and they had put the show back on the air. But unfortunately, the show didn't last too much longer after that. It only lasted a few years because there was another guy who came on television on the national scale by the name of Captain Kangaroo. And Captain Kangaroo just absolutely killed Wixie's Wonderland. But again, this was a milestone show, and it was one that I felt was very much worth showcasing. I don't know if anybody remembers this guy, Sagebrush Shorty. And Sagebrush Shorty, his real name was Ted Lloyd, and there you see him with Bronco Billy Buttons, who was one of his dummies. His other one was Skinny Dugan. And both of those dummies were very much patterned after Edgar Bergen's puppets. You had Bronco Billy Buttons here, who was a lot like Mortimer Snurd, very slow-witted, slow in speech, didn't always get it. And then you had Bergen's Charlie McCarthy, which was very quick-witted, smart-mouthed dummy, and that was Skinny Dugan. But Sagebrush is probably the closest thing that we had to an Edgar Bergen combo with Howdy Doody, because Howdy Doody, very popular show at the time, Western themed. Our version was Sagebrush Shorty. This was a show that aired on WJBK Channel 2, and it came from San Antonio, Texas, actually. For some reason, George B. Story, the gentleman who we hired as the station manager, a guy by the name of Michelson, I believe was his last name. Michelson was very big on recruiting shows from San Antonio, and I think it was because it was a market that he had worked in. But anyway, Sagebrush was very popular at that time, so he was recruited to come up to WJBK. What's interesting too about this show was, like many of the children's shows, I mean, it was a wraparound cartoons, and Sage did his little bits in and out there. On the weekends, he had children on the show. They would play games. Cub Scout troops would be there, Brownie troops. And there was always, this pyramid of prizes of all the toys that he would give away. But he used to have a guy on there, very frequent guest by the name of Don Hunt. Don Hunt was the owner of a pet shop in Ferndale. And Don Hunt kind of went by a nickname called Bawana Don. And he used to have a chimp called Bongo Bailey? Bongo Bailey was the chimp's name. Well, Sage used to have his wife, her name was Marie. She was a very big, burly woman who used to yell at Sage a lot. And most people, none of you probably would know this, but Sage, because he was having such marital problems behind the scenes, he would always yell at his dummy all the time, and he'd have the dummy say stuff that his wife would say to him, and then he would take his anger out of it. And this is something that used to crack the stage people up all the time, because they'd walk by his dressing room, and there he'd be in there yelling at his dummy. So, but anyway, Marie was the wrangler, the audience wrangler. So she always kept brought the kids in, kind of kept the kids in line, and she would bring the guests on, walk them on. Well, this one day when Bawana Don was on there, and he had his chimp, Bongo Bailey, Marie was a little rough with him, and Bongo Bailey bit her. And so she turned around and decided to sue Channel 2. And while Channel 2 was in this litigation, all of a sudden they decided, well, what are we keeping Sage for? So since we're in litigation with his wife, they canned Sagebrush Shorty. So he was gone for about 2 years, and then he reappeared again on Channel 7. And the reason Channel 7 took him was because he had to hire his root beer account, and they wanted that. So he was on there, and the show was called Circle 7 Ranch. And he was on there for just a few years before he finally rode off into the sunset. He went out to California because he thought he was going to make it real big out there. After all, Sufi did, so he thought he could too, but Ted Lloyd just never made it. It didn't work out for him, and he lived out the rest of his life in California until he died in 1999. But we also had clowns too, and the most popular of all the clowns was Milky, a Detroit original. He was very much a gimmick from Twin Pines. The advertising agency, Luckoff Wayburn, which had the Twin Pines account in 1950, decided that they wanted to sponsor a show that would help sell their dairy products, and they wanted to sell them to children because children would, go tug at their mother's skirts, come on, Mom, give me some Twin Pines milk or some Twin Pines ice cream. And so they decided they wanted to have a clown, and the clown would be Milky. Now, the guy originally chosen to be Milky the Clown was Carol Fox, who was a renowned magician at the time. And Carol Fox, unfortunately, during the development of the show, got his draft notice. And so he was then asked, well, do you know anybody who can do what you do, magic-wise? So he recommended one of his best friends, whose name was Claire Cummings, who is a paint salesman for DuPont. And Claire is the one that you see pictured in there as Milky. A lot of people can tell which one was Claire and which one was Carol because Claire is the one with the space between the teeth. That famous smile of Milky's that you see right there. I'm afraid I couldn't make the picture any bigger. This is my first experience using PowerPoint, so please bear with me on some of these smaller pictures. But anyway, Claire was the one who helped develop the look of Milky. And actually, it was his wife who came up with the costume. She was thinking of the opera clown Pagliacci. And so the costume was patterned after Pagliacci, and then Claire decided what the face should look like. It would be white, and then of course he just ran some black down from his eyes, and then came up with that look that you see there. But Milky, unlike your traditional clowns, Milky was a magical clown. Milky was dignified. He wasn't a clown that was the butt of jokes or did silly things. What they wanted was a clown with some dignity, and that's the reason why they had chosen a magician. And magic at that time was very, very big, and it's something that kept kids' attention a lot. But the interesting thing is that sometimes Milky ended up looking like a fool because back then, of course, it was live television and mistakes did happen. And there was this guy, this director that they had over at Channel 2 when Milky started. Incidentally, Milky was on all of the channels. He was on Channel 2 for the beginning, then he was on Channel 7 for a while, and then he was on Channel 4. And Channel 4 is where he was on the longest. And when he was originally on Channel 2, it was a program that just featured old Western movies, really bad Westerns, what was called a C grade or a D grade Western. I mean, we all know what a B film is. It's not the same as the A-list films, but these Westerns were really bad Westerns. Well, there was this one director who never knew where he was with timing. So at the end of a Western, when the posse is chasing the bad guys, and all of a sudden they're approaching a cliff, and you don't know what the bad guys are going to do, before you could see what could happen, all of a sudden this director would cut right to Milky. And all of a sudden there's Milky looking very surprised. What am I supposed to do? So things like that would happen. Sometimes they would blow the secrets on his trick because they'd get in real tight. And all of his magic was sleight of hand magic. He didn't do things like make your parents disappear. But it was all sleight of hand, and they would get so tight on him that you could actually see the secrets. And so Claire was very insistent that they do wider shots on that. But also along with Milky, you had different people on there. When he got to Channel 4, they expanded the show to include an audience. They called it Milky's Party Time. You had the Milkman, you had Mary Lou, and you had Pierre. But the Milkman was there right from the beginning. He did all the Twin Pines commercials, and there were 4 different milkmen. The one that did it the longest was a guy by the name of John Leslie, and John Leslie unfortunately met with a very tragic accident. His pilot light went out on his furnace, and he went to go relight it, and it blew up. And the guy who ended up replacing him, a lot of you folks know, was Bob Allison. And very young Bob Allison. In fact, if I go back here, that's Bob Allison right there as the Milkman. And Bob, what was interesting too is when I sat down and interviewed him about this, I didn't even really get a chance to ask him any questions because he just went on and on and on and on. And finally at the end, I said, well, thank you for the interview. He said, what interview? I gave you a monologue. So, but he was one of the 4 Milkmen. And there's Carol Fox as Milky. What happened was in 1964, Claire Cummings was looking to retire because Milky was a part-time job. As much as he loved doing Milky and it consumed a lot of his free time, he was getting ready to retire from DuPont and he wanted to just retire, period. So Carol Fox, who had been his understudy all these years, because when Carol came back, he was actually guaranteed the role of Milky. He was told that he could take it away from Claire, but Carol saw how much fun Claire was having with it. He decided he couldn't do it, and so he became the understudy. But in 1964, when Claire retired, then Carol took his place. And that's also when the show went into color. So if you saw Milky in black and white, you saw Claire Cummings. If you saw him in color, then you saw Carol Fox. And Carol Fox also portrayed Milky in a lot of personal appearances after the run of Milky, after it was canceled in 1967. And it was canceled basically because the worry-free delivery that Twin Pines prided themselves on was in trouble. The show had become a huge expense, a huge advertising expense for them, and grocery stores started a price cut on milk. And in fact, the price cut was so drastic that people started buying their milk in the grocery stores, and the home delivery became obsolete. And as we all know, in the early 70s, it was virtually gone by that time. So Milky left in 1967, but again, it's a Detroit original, and probably the most endearing of all the clowns. Another one was Ricky the Clown. Ricky, unlike Bozo, which was a manufactured clown, and unlike Milky, that was an advertising magical clown, Ricky was really a true circus clown. Irv Romig, who was Ricky the Clown, he was with the Shrine Circus, and he was also with Ringling Brothers. And he was offered to come and do his circus stuff on Channel 7, but then they decided, no, we don't want you, and then he decided to go back with the circus, and while he was with the circus, all of a sudden Channel 7, decided we want you back. So he came back, and he's somebody who debuted in 1953, along with Sufi and with Wixie, which is another reason, too, why it's such a magical year, because 3 of the biggest shows came on at that time. But Ricky the Clown used to have a llama on the show, if any of you remember that. It was the only show to feature something like that. But he also had, too, because he lived right across the street from Channel 7, he also had his own little amusement park, too. He used to build his own props, his wagons. A lot of the stuff that was featured on his show in the way of props were all developed by Irv Romig and built by him. And he had a little thing called Ricky Land that was, again, on 10 Mile Road. But Irv Romig, again, a big pioneer in local television, and he still does to this day. He does his clown bits. In fact, I did a event, a breakfast with some of the old TV stars back in July, and he came out dressed as Ricky, doing a lot of his old shticks. So Irv Romig, a man who's in his 80s, still clowning around. And this is a clown that a lot of people recognize, and of all generations, for the most part, Bozo. Bozo was developed in California by Capitol Records by a guy named Alan W. Livingston, and this was back in the 1940s. He was asked to develop a book that would accompany a record. If you remember the old record albums, and for the children, they would have like a little storybook that would go along with the record. Well, the very first one was a Bozo record, and it was done by Alan W. Livingston, who eventually became the president of Capitol Records, and he's the guy who gave the Beatles their very first gold record in 1964. But anyway, Bozo became a very popular clown through cartoons. If you remember, there were some Bozo cartoons. There was only about 39 of them, but they were very, they were bad cartoons, but at the same time, too, they played them over and over and over again. Well, what happened was a guy by the name of Larry Harmon started buying up all the rights to everything Bozo, and Larry Harmon was somebody who had worked for Alan W. Livingston. And Harmon bought the rights to everything. He finally acquired the rights to the character of Bozo the Clown. And what he did was he decided to go around the country and sell a show that would be wrapped around those same 39 cartoons. And every television market in the country could have their own Bozo show. So he came to Detroit in 1959, and this was our very first Bozo. His name is Bob McMahon. Bob McMahon unfortunately just passed away this past year, this last November. But I was fortunate enough to talk with him before then, and Bob got the job because Bob was also a circus clown, like Ricky, but he wasn't as experienced as Ricky. He didn't spend as much time in the circus. But he had an in at Channel 4. Channel 4 was where our first Bozo show was in the 50s up to about 1967. And our first Bozo, who was popular with the baby boomers, just did clown acts between the cartoons. And it was just Bozo. He would have, sometimes he'd have policemen on the show giving safety tips. He'd have other circus people on there. But it wasn't the same Bozo show that would later come on at Channel 9. And what happened was in 1967, Larry Harmon was raising the franchise fee. Larry Harmon was getting, I guess what you could say, very greedy. And every year he kept upping the fees for those cartoons. And finally Channel 4 in 1967 said, you know what, we're going to dump these cartoons. And so Channel 9 picked it up. And when Channel 9 picked it up, they decided to do a very different show than what Channel 4 did. They decided that they would add more characters to it. They would add a peanut gallery. And they chose Art Servey, who was the head of guest relations for the very popular dance show Swinging Time. And Art, because he did such a good job with the kids, they decided to make him the Bozo. And he became Bozo all the way up until 1979. Bozo stayed on Channel 9 up until 1977, but then of course the Canadian border laws had changed at that time. And they decided to get rid of all the American talent, and so Bozo was fired, and so Channel 2 picked it up for its last 2 years. And there you see Art Servey with Mr. Calliope in the middle. It was actually Mr. Calliope, but Bozo pronounced him as Calliope. And then Mr. Houdini there, who did the magic tricks. And of course, one of the many games that was played on the show, the foot in the bucket. One of the things too about this Bozo show was they never believed in losers. They had winners and almost winners. So every kid that was on there was always a winner. And every kid always left with something, whether it was a six-pack of Orange Crush or the giant Tootsie Roll, or games from Mattel. No child ever left empty-handed on Bozo. A very different clown right here was Ooopsie. And Ooopsie was also Bob McMahon, who was our first Bozo, because when they decided at Channel 4 to let go of the cartoons, they decided they wanted to keep Bob. And they said, you know, we're going to dump the cartoons, but we want you to stay. Can you do another clown? And he said, okay, well, I've got this character in mind. How much time do we got? They said 2 weeks. So he said, okay. So in 1967, flower power was, kind of in vogue at the time. And McMahon, because he saw all these daisies painted around everywhere, he decided that his clown would be a giant daisy. And you can see the petals at the end of his pant legs and the end of his sleeves there, and of course the top hat. And the name Ooopsie came from his grandmother, because his grandmother, when she would pick him up, she would say, oops, or oopsie daisy. But what's interesting was she was really saying upsie daisy, but McMahon, because his grandmother had this very thick accent, to him it always sounded like oopsie daisy. So that's where he got the name from. But Ooopsie was a clown that was kind of more educational. I mean, he did goofy things, little bits there, like with Mr. Pouch. And then he had his little puppets, Squiggly Wiggly Worm and Miser Mouse. But he used to do kind of like educational things too. He would show you how to make things, like little craft projects. I can remember him showing us how to build a house out of popsicle sticks. And he also used to have the Daisyville Art Gallery, which was A big favorite where children would send in drawings, and then they would play classical music, and then he'd say, oh, here's a nice one from Billy from Grosse Pointe. And so as a child, you could always send things into Ooopsie, drawings, and sooner or later it would make his art gallery. Once kids got older, the baby boomers got older, programming changed too, and we had a very popular dance show that was called Swinging Time. And there you see right there in the center was Robin Seymour. Everybody remembers Bobbin with Robin on WKMH radio, and then later Keener 13. Swinging Time was a very popular dance show. It wasn't the first one. We had like Ed McKenzie's Saturday Party, which is very popular in the 50s, but this is the one that the baby boomers would remember, because as they became teenagers, Swinging Time came out at that time. Again, Robin Seymour, who was one of the most popular disc jockeys at the time. The show came out of an idea he had for a dance show called Teen Town, and it was Teen Town for a few years, and then it evolved into Swinging Time. And Swinging Time got the premier talent, like this gentleman here that you see, Pat Boone. And the great thing about a show like Swinging Time, and just to kind of give you an idea of what the Detroit market was like at that time, all the big stars, when they came on, they did these little local shows, and they gave you the same performance that they gave Dick Clark on American Bandstand. They came in the same kind of clothes that they would wear, and again, they didn't look at it as like, oh, here's a local show I got to do. They gave it the same amount of energy, so you got to see the same performance here at home. And Swinging Time, along with this show called Club 1270, which was a Channel 7 dance show, both of these became the premier outlets for Motown, because Motown was just getting started at that time, and Berry Gordy wanted to prep his talent for television, and the vehicle that he used was obviously local TV. And so what happened was shows like Club 1270 and Swinging Time became the outlet. So we got to see, the Supremes and Marvin Gaye and the Temptations, all of them, before the rest of the world did. I mean, obviously we heard them, but we also got to see the performances on television. I'm going to kind of go a little quicker because I realize I've got quite a few other shows to do, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. Here's a show that was very popular during the 70s. It was our version of Soul Train. It was called The Scene, and it was the very first big show on Channel 62. Channel 62 was the first minority-owned station in the country, and The Scene was right there at the premiere of it all. And right there, the older gentleman, Nat Morris, was the host of the show, and he also did some things that Don Cornelius of Soul Train ended up kind of copying. On Soul Train, if you've ever seen the show, they have the Soul Train line, where they have a boys line and a girls line, where they all come down and each do their little dances. Well, The Scene was the first show to do that. Soul Train did have a dance line, but it was couples that would come down. And Nat got the idea, well, why don't we just have a boys line and a girls line? So it was something that Soul Train later picked up. But this was a show that showcased the black culture that was going on during the 70s and 80s. There's one of the popular dancers from the show, Fast Freddie. The show had this huge, huge following. In fact, many of the dancers were stars themselves. If you saw them at any of the local malls, they were stars. Fast Freddie was one of them. And then there's a couple more, LaWanda and Pam. And of course the show, because as you see by the outfits that they're wearing, there were people that thought that the show was a disgrace because of the provocative clothes that they would wear. But at the same time too, Nat Morris had felt that this show really showcased the black youth culture that was going on, and hairstyles and fashion styles and certainly dance steps were all copied. And it was interesting too, is some of the best dancers, some that came out of this area, people who went on to Dance Fever and won, came from The Scene. And a lot of dance moves that were featured on Soul Train were developed by our local dancers here because people would copy them. These were dances that they would make up And then when they saw somebody on Soul Train doing it, it's like, oh my God. So again, a very, very powerful show. It had a huge, huge following. And in a lot of ways, it was very much a culture by itself. The next picture here, yeah, that's also the scene. There's Nat with the Brothers Johnson. They had a lot of the soul and rhythm and blues artists of the day on that show. One of the things too, I'll just say real quick, that a lot of people probably remember is all the technical mistakes that this show is very popular for. They didn't have the best equipment to work with, and a lot of times when their cameras would start to go, their solution was just go ahead and hit it on the side, and it would adjust itself. So there was a lot of technical mistakes on that show, but again, it was a local show. That was the charm of it. We also had our share of movie hosts, and there was a very young, well, I shouldn't say young, but a younger Bill Kennedy. He came in to Detroit television in 1956, in fact on August 10th, 1956, and he's a guy who was a B movie star, who had tried very hard to make it as an actor out in Hollywood, but when it wasn't happening for him, in fact here's a photo, a publicity photo of him during his Hollywood days. The photo was taken from a movie called I believe it was called Two Lost Worlds. Well, when it wasn't happening for Bill, there was a woman by the name of Anastasia Buell. And Anastasia Buell, you can see her portrait in the upper corner there. That's a photo that was always on Bill's set. And people always wondered who this lady was. And it wasn't his wife, it wasn't his mother, it was Anastasia Buell, who was I believe the editor of the Grosse Pointe paper. She was from here, from the Points. And she's the one who really believed in Bill. And she gave him his first review when he had started in television here, but bombed out. And she always stayed in touch with him, so when he went back to California for the second time, and looked like he was having a great career, but it just didn't happen for him, she was the one who told him, hey, come back here and give it a try. And it was her faith in Bill that really brought him back, and he never forgot it. So if you always remember at the end of the show, he would always kind of do a little like this, or he would tip his hat if he was wearing his checkered fedora. He always tipped his hat to her before he would disappear into the shadows to the theme music just in time. And very, very influential person. But Bill also, like many of the dance shows, he got Hollywood people on his show, and there you see him with the Supremes. Incidentally, I did interview Mary Wilson of the Supremes for the book. I did interview her as a fan and actually appearing on some of these shows. And let me see what's the next photo. There's Bill with Charlton Heston. His Sunday show was the one that had all the primo guests. And the great thing about it too was you knew these were big stars, and there they were. They were either in the studio at Channel 9 or they were at the studio at Channel 50. It was on Channel 9 up until the late 60s when Channel 9 decided to dump all of their movie hosts and their children's show. And that's because RKO had bought the station and decided to make that change. And then that's when Channel 50 bought all that stuff up. And then Channel 50 became the most profitable UHF station in the country because it had all its children's shows and the king of movies, Bill Kennedy there. A lot of people probably remember Bill for his fabulous files, all the stills that he used to show on his program. He used to take all the trivia questions. One of the things about Bill was he liked to give the illusion that he was very much off the cuff, that he knew everything about movies, but he didn't. And he was very, very meticulous in researching things. He would always have notes and clippings that he would bring with him to prep him on the movies. But every now and then somebody would throw a question out there that he couldn't answer, and then he'd look into the camera. What was he talking about? So a prime example of that was there was a time when he was trying to think of an actor's name, and he's like, oh, there's this actor, he's on a Western, and his name is right on the tip of my tongue, I know who it is. Well, we'll go right into the movie, and when we come back, I'll have his name. Well, there was a guy by the name of Wayne Stevens who was on, he's a disc jockey for CKWW Radio, and when he was young, he was on the set of Bill's show, And so when they went back into the movie, Wayne Stevens said, Mr. Kennedy, the actor you were thinking of was James Arness. And all of a sudden Bill, well, why didn't you say something? You left me hanging there. Don't ever do that again. So, you know, again, Bill liked to have people think he was off the cuff, but that wasn't always the case. And another thing, too, people don't know that, some people know this, but not everybody, is if you remember the old George Reeves Superman show, the voice at the very beginning, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, that's Bill Kennedy. And Bill Kennedy was very, very proud of that. That was one of his high moments, and at the same time a very low moment, because when that was recorded, he was at the Desilu Studios in California, and they were in the theater recording it. They were doing take after take after take after take, because he just couldn't get it right in the amount of time. Well, seated in the theater by himself comes Charlie Chaplin. And when Bill Kennedy saw him, he thought, wow, here's my opportunity to audition for Charlie Chaplin. You know, if I do a really good job, maybe he'll give me something, because at that time Chaplin was head of United Artists. So he gave it his all, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and it was the final take, it was the one that they ended up using. And all of a sudden, here comes Chaplin, he comes over, and Bill Kennedy thinks, wow, you know, he's gonna give me something. And Chaplin just comes over and he says, young man, you have a very big voice. And then he turned around and he walked away. So Bill was very deflated by that, but at the same time, it was something that he was very, very proud of. Another movie host, too, that is well remembered was Rita Bell, Prize Movie. And if you remember at Prize Movie, she used to play a tune, and you used to have to name that tune. And you may not know this, but the guy who actually picked the tunes to be played on there was Eric Smith of Channel 7. Eric, it turns out, worked on a lot of these old shows, and his first job was to pick the tunes on Prize Movie. And Rita Bell was someone who they used to like to trip up all the time, because she could never get the name of one of her sponsors correct. She had a sponsor on there, Amy Joy Donuts. And she would always screw it up every time she had to say Amy Joy Donuts. She would say Amy Joy Donuts. And she'd practice it all the time back stage, and then when she'd go on the air, she'd blow it. So the stagehands used to take advantage of her. One time she had Peter Pan peanut butter. And if you can guess what they told her, they said, you know, now Rita, be careful, don't go on there and say Peter Pan penis butter. Sure enough, when she went on there, on the air, that's just what came out of her mouth. And then also, too, they did the same thing with Wonder Bread. You know, remember, Rita, it's not the breast in bed. And so what ended up happening was she went out there and said exactly that. But Rita had a good sense of humor about it, because she liked to be thought of as one of the guys. She just loved to have jokes played on her. And that was just, again, a real good example of all the fun that they used to have in local television. If that happened today, you'd be fired. So very, very different era. Another movie host, a lot of people probably remember this guy, Sir Graves Ghastly. And his real name was Lawson Deming, and Sir Graves Ghastly actually came out of a show called Woodrow the Woodsman. I don't know if anybody remembers that one, but there was a guy named Clay Conroy who was Woodrow, and this was on Channel 2. And the guy who was the puppeteer, did all the voices, was Lawson Deming. And Lawson became more popular than Woodrow did. So what ended up happening was, when they canned Woodrow, they decided, hey, you know, Lawson, we're going to do this horror show on Saturdays, and we'd like you to host it. So he came up with this this vampire character that was very gothic-like, very kid-friendly. He didn't want to do anything that was too much like the traditional vampire, the blood-sucking and all the religious themes. He decided this was going to be a very friendly vampire. And so, like, when kids would write letters in, and that was another great thing about a local show like this, is that kids would write in letters and ask him questions. They'd say, like, what's your favorite food? And he'd say, oh, I like spaghetti, but not too much garlic. No, garlic is very bad. Or they'd say, you know, what's your favorite drink? And he'd say, type O. And so, you know, he was able to incorporate some things, but not, you know, not to where it became horrifying or shocking to children. What's interesting too is that Lawson Deming did all these characters. He had a whole host of characters like Real McCoy, which was this little gnome that dug up all of the film reels. He had Tilly Trollhouse, who was him in drag, and then he also had this upside down mouth that a lot of people remember called the Blob that did all these lip syncs to these songs. And you just see it was his upside down mouth, a little face on his chin, and they have the Blob come on. You see Sir Graves sitting there, and then all of a sudden you hear blah 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 blah, and the Blob would come on, and then start doing his little songs. All the characters that were on there were all Lawson Deming, and this was a show that really had to rely a lot on special effects, a lot of chroma keying, and I think it was really our very first show to really amplify that to a huge proportion to where that became the show. All of his bits, again, all relied very heavily on these special effects, unlike the other shows. But Lawson Deming is still with us, by the way. He's 91 years old, or he was 91 years old when I interviewed him in 2004. And his best memory of being Sir Graves Ghastly had nothing to do really with being on the set of the show or doing the show. It was doing the public appearances. And it was all the children who would come up and wrap their arms around his legs and say, "Sir Graves Ghastly, we love you." And then he'd say, "Sir Graves loves you too." And a lot of people remember that laugh of his, that laugh that he would do, that his wife, Mary Rita, said was so annoying, but that was the most imitated gimmick of anybody in Detroit TV. Wherever he would go, you just hear shrieks of that all out in the audience. And Sir Graves, while he was a lovable horror host, we had this guy too, if you remember the Ghoul. And the Ghoul was late night. He did all the outrageous things, took late night horror to an all-time low. You probably remember him coming on sometimes with a gas mask, and he'd have a trash can, and there'd be smoke coming out, and he'd say, "Well, this is tonight's movie, and it really stinks." So he would also do things like blow up food. He blew up a lot of food. He also had a little rubber frog called Froggy that he would constantly blow up to. That was his nemesis. But Ron Sweet, who is the Ghoul, is very mild-mannered and soft-spoken. You would never guess that they're one and the same. But this character was actually evolved from a character that was done in Ohio called Ghoulardi. And Ernie Anderson actually developed that costume. Ernie Anderson became the voice of ABC. He's the voice that you always heard say, "The Love Boat." And Ernie did this character back in the 60s, and Ron Sweet went to work for Ernie Anderson. And when he tried to get Ernie to come back from ABC to Ohio to revive the Ghoulardi character, Ernie Anderson said that the Ghoulardi had his day and it's time to put it to rest. Well, then Ron said, "Well, then can I do that?" And so Anderson said, "Okay, you're welcome. Here's the costume. Go ahead, but you can't use the name Ghoulardi because that's copyrighted. So just chop off the Artie, call yourself the Ghoul." And that's what Ron became, was the Ghoul. And this guy still to this day has a following. Still does all kinds of appearances, and you'd be amazed at how many people turn out to see him and just to watch him blow things up. Kelly and Company, John and Marilyn, our gateway to the stars, the most popular talk show, and there they are looking like stars themselves. And I gotta tell you, they were wonderful people to interview. I felt right at home. I was very intimidated by talking to them at first, because I thought, wow, this is John Kelly and Marilyn Turner. They're such big stars. And I mean, I was really nervous. And then they had a way of just, relaxing you and making you feel right at home, that by the end of the interview, if they would have asked me to stay for dinner, I would have. So, but on their show, certainly, one of the things that you remember was there were big stars on there every single day. And they particularly showcased a lot of soap stars. And there you see Judith Light, who later became a big primetime star with her show, Who's the Boss? But prior to that, she was on One Life to Live, and that was during her One Life to Live days. And actually, Kelly and Company became one of the premier outlets for ABC daytime because the same people who watched the soap operas watched the early morning talk shows. So John and Marilyn never talked down about the soap operas like a lot of talk shows where they make fun of them. They knew that was important to their audience, so they played on that, and they got a lot of the soap stars. But soap stars and A-list stars weren't the only things featured on the show. You probably remember they did a lot of cooking shows, they did fashion shows, they had animals on there, but again, they were our gateway to the stars, and it was a sad thing when John Kelly had to leave the show. They had a new program director at the very end, because if you remember, the show became Company. It's last year, and they featured another woman on there with Marilyn by the name of Nikki Granberry. And unfortunately, what had happened was John Kelly was told, "Hey, it's time for you to go." And this new program manager wanted the show just to be very female-oriented, and she felt John had no place on there. So she basically axed John from the show. And then she had hired her friend, Nikki Granberry. Well, it was a very odd pairing because Nikki was like over 6 feet tall, and you had Marilyn, who was just a tiny little thing. So it looked very odd to begin with. And the other thing was, Marilyn always played cutesy to John for all these years. And, suddenly the show took on a very serious tone, and now she had to be equal with this other lady, and it just wasn't working out. And unfortunately, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, fortunately, actually, Channel 7 kind of knew that the show isn't what it was, and so they pulled the plug on the show. And when they pulled the plug on the show, it was the day that they taped the last show, and nobody knew it was the last show. But all of a sudden, they were told after that, that's it. And but it did have a good long run, and it's very fondly remembered. In fact, John Kelly had said that. He still gets people on the streets coming up to him saying, "I never missed a morning." And then you also had, too, another talk show. Well, there's another big star that was on there, John Forsythe, working the audience with John Kelly there. You had another talk show host, Sonia Friedman, Dr. Sonia Friedman, the very first psychologist that was on television. And the interesting thing about her was that she was also the very first show to be nationally syndicated on cable, and it was done right here out of the studios at WDIV. But she was the first to really kind of probe, her guests and really kind of understand what drove them to do the things that they did, and what can we learn from it. Even though she's looked upon in a lot of circles as a real feminist, because she's disliked by a lot of people as well. For that, she's a woman who really stood up for her convictions, and that came across on the show, but she always wanted people to learn something from it. And she was the first person really to not only psychoanalyze the guests, but at the very end kind of give a summation of what this all meant at the end of the show. Now, of course, all of our talk show hosts, they're all psychologists, and they all have something to say at the end why this happened. But real quickly, one of the interesting things that happened on her show was she had John Walsh on there, and if you know who John Walsh is from America's Most Wanted, John Walsh, his son Adam, was kidnapped, and later turns out he was murdered. But while they were waiting for the news, to find out where their kidnapped son was, the Walshes made an appearance on Sonia, and it was the day after actually that they were on Sonia while they were still in Detroit that they got the news that their child was murdered. And incidentally, while they were on the show, as visibly shaken as they were seated in the greeting room with Jesse Jackson, who was on the show as well. So it kind of gives you, she got a lot of the big guests too, but she didn't last as long as Kelly and Company. But she was also the first show, because she was on cable, she was the very first talk show to win the Cable Ace Awards. If you remember, before cable became a part of the Emmys, they had a Cable Ace Award. And the very first show to get that for the category of talk was Sonia. And there's another photo of Sonia working the audience. Probably the most controversial figure we ever had on Detroit television was Lou Gordon. And there's Lou in all of his glory, with his hard-hitting journalistic style. And certainly what you see today with Bill O'Reilly and Craig Matthews, this is what Lou was doing back in 1965. And Lou Gordon used to have a lot of political guests because politics was really what he was into the most. He had a lot of sensational guests on there too, like Joey the Hitman or Miss Nude USA, but he had those on strictly for ratings. It was sweeps time. But primarily he wanted the political guests on there. He would have guests on there too that he would always somehow detect an element of phoniness in. And one of Lou's biggest things was to get people to walk off his show. And, you know, he had George Wallace walk off his show. I mean, he would ask these people real controversial stuff, like Billy Hayes, for example, the guy, if you remember the movie Midnight Express, the guy who was caught trying to smuggle hashish out of Turkey and ended up spending time in a Turkish prison and later escaped. Well, he was on Lou's show, and Lou actually asked him, did you pay back all the money to your parents that they spent trying to buy your way out of jail? I mean, these are the kinds of things. He asked Ralph Nader if he was a homosexual. So, you know, again, that's kind of what made Lou very controversial. But just a real funny story was he had Erica Jong on there, who was the author of The Fear of Flying. And he was giving Erica Jong a hard time because she said that she was comparing herself to great writers like Ernest Hemingway, and he says, come on, Miss Jong, I detect an element of phoniness here. And she got really angry, and she stood up and she stormed out of the studio. And she got back at Lou the following week because she was doing this, or actually it was a couple days later, she was doing this other show. And she said, you know, I was just on this show in this cornfield in a suburb of Detroit, and this hostile interviewer whose toupee looked like a pork chop who was insulting me. So, you know, she kind of got back at Lou, but Lou's most famous interview was with the gentleman that you see him with right there, the former governor of Michigan, George Romney. And as you well know, Romney had presidential aspirations, and what he wanted to do was run for president, and he was asked right off the bat, first question by Lou, and Lou wasn't trying to put him in a bad light or anything like that. Lou just wanted to know what George Romney was all about. And that's when Romney said that he changed his views on Vietnam because he felt you know, they did a lot of brainwashing, and because he said that he had been brainwashed, a very poor choice of words, you know, the national media picked up on it and it killed his presidential aspirations. But interestingly enough, when it happened, nobody thought anything of it. When Lou didn't think anything of it, nobody at Channel 50 did. But back in those days, they used to reuse the tapes because they didn't have enough tape stock to library the shows. So before the tape that had Romney on it was recorded over, somebody on the wire had picked up, you know, about Romney's brainwash statement and had called Channel 50 to confirm that. And the person who answered the phone confirmed it, and then next thing you know, it made national news. But it was never the intention of the Lou Gordon program or Lou himself to hurt Romney's career. But you know, with his very stern political convictions, I had heard from his daughter. I thought this was interesting. Was he was on Nixon's enemies list because he absolutely hated Richard Nixon and criticized Nixon a lot. And he, when he found out he was on Nixon's enemies list, he was absolutely delighted. But Lou, being as controversial as he was, there was actually death threats made against him. There was a time when the FBI and the state police had to follow his family because of all the death threats. So, and there you see him with his wife Jackie, who was a fixture on the show. And rounding the last handful of shows here, this was the Lady of Charm. I don't know if any of you remember, but your parents probably remember her. This was a woman who was doing what Martha Stewart does today. She was a cooking show, a fashion show. She was basically a lady of etiquette. And she showed you how to, you know, set the table and how to cook things. And it was a show that really amplified the image of the Happy Housewife in the 1950s. It was a very, very popular show with the housewives during the 50s. And I got to tell you something too, that with that show, not only was it a popular show, but Edith Fern Melrose was a very, very influential lady. She was the very first program manager for a radio station in the entire U.S., very first woman to do that. And she was such a powerful lady at Channel 7 because she brought all these sponsors in. Her show was initially rejected. John Pybel said, we don't need the Lady of Charm here. But she came back with these sponsors, so they couldn't refuse. And what happened one time was, because she would always showcase her products by saying, when she would pull something out of the oven, "Thank you, Amanda," or "Here's my new Frigidaire," or whatever. And she'd always call the appliances by their brand names. And one time Sears called Channel 7 and said, "You got to do something about that Lady of Charm there, because we're running out of appliances faster than the manufacturer can make them." And looking at the old photos of her when I was given her archives, I couldn't get over just to see the masses of people that turned out to see her at a speaking engagement. And Edith Fern Melrose is a name that today, if you ask people that name, they wouldn't know it. But it just kind of shows you how times have changed and how easily it is to forget people. But she was somebody who I thought was very worth showcasing because of what she had contributed to local television. She was also the only person in local television, probably in the country, I don't know that for sure, but at least I know here in Michigan, to actually have a house built. She used to have a house au charme. In fact, she had 3 of them. It was all built with sponsored money, and it was like where she would test products. So when people, when companies would send in products, she would test them out in her house au charme. And I don't think anybody since, again, and it could even be nationally, has had that kind of clout to where they could actually have homes built. And they were built right here, I believe, in the Points. At least I know one of them was. And seeing pictures of those too, I mean, they weren't cheap homes either. I mean, built with the best of everything. And to have that kind of clout was really, really incredible. Here's somebody else too that you probably remember. Before we had the Travel Channel, we had George Perot. And George Perot's World Adventure Series and George Perot Presents showcased a lot of people's movies. They would come on to the travel logs. People like Stan Midgley would go on there and actually show their movies. And one of the things that used to happen on George's show quite frequently was him falling asleep during these films. And it's kind of understandable because if people show like their vacation movies or whatever, nobody wants to sit through and watch those. And George had seen these, hundreds of times because he would have the same speakers on there, year after year. And so George, a lot of times, would fall asleep during the show, and you would just hear this during these films. But it was always the stage manager's job to give George, a little nudge there to wake him up, and then he'd be like a drunken sailor. We'll be back with more of Stan Midgley's trip to Africa after these messages. But George also used to like to ask a lot of questions about food, too, if you remember. And he would ask a lot about desserts, anything with whipped cream on there. You could almost see him salivating because, he just wanted to talk a lot about the food, lots of questions on that. And interestingly enough, George was a big eater of wild game. There used to be a restaurant near City Airport, I can't remember the name of it, but it used to serve a lot of exotic game foods like monkey fingers and zebra, things like that. And George used to eat there quite frequently. And he'd take the people at the TV station there, and Eric Smith was one of the people there who worked on a show and said he was just totally grossed out when they served the monkey fingers. So that's a little known fact about George. But George is somebody who, again, showed us all these exotic destinations before there was such a thing as a travel channel. And it was also an era, too, when people couldn't really travel as much as they do now. While George took people around the world, Morton F. here took people all over Michigan. And if you remember Michigan Outdoors, there's Mort, who was the host of the show for the longest run. And, Mort used to really upset a lot of the I guess you could say the lodges in like northern Michigan, whatever, more would say that the fish are biting here or the honey's good there, there'd be this deluge of, hunters and fishermen that would show up there, and all the lodging places would get upset because they didn't have enough accommodations for everybody. But it just gives you an idea of the clout that Mort had. And Mort, incidentally, was not a hunter or a fisherman. He was never intending to be the host of the show. He was going to be the producer, but there was a conflict with the original host, and who was a magazine writer. The magazine the magazine didn't want the writer to host a television show, so while they were looking for a substitute, Mort had to fill in, and he ended up just doing it throughout its run. There's one of his most popular guests seated right next to him, a guy by the name of Paul Allen, same name as Kutek Paul, but this guy was really well known for being a snake charmer. He used to have snakes on his show, and he used to have these first aid kits that he made, and he'd have the snakes bite him on the show, and then he would show you how to take the venom out, and that's why you see his arm bandage there. And oddly enough, or I should say not surprisingly enough, this gentleman died one year because he got bit by a snake. He got bit by a cobra. A cobra that he had got loose, went under a car, and he tried to retrieve it, and the cobra bit him and he died. But there was a Mort's show primarily, again, was all outdoors, featured everything that was great about the outdoors in Michigan. And there was a really controversial interview that he had on there one time with Jacques Cousteau. When this fellow, Jerry Chiappetta, arrived and co-hosted the show with Mort for a while, and then Chiappetta took it over because he ended up buying the show from Mort. They decided at Channel 7 that they were going to have Jacques Cousteau on there because he was promoting his latest documentary, Under Fire and Ice. And so when Cousteau was on there, Chiappetta starts out with the question, Captain Cousteau, what do you think about the currents of the Great Lakes, and ask him questions about that. And Cousteau gets on there and he says, I know nothing of your Great Lakes. And then he says, well, what do you think of, like the beautiful scenery of Michigan, something like that. And Cousteau says, I know nothing of Michigan. And so he says, Captain Cousteau, maybe you could recommend a good seafood restaurant in Paris. And Cousteau says, I do not eat seafood. And then Chiappetta said, well, come on, I've seen your documentaries. I've seen the guys on the Calypso eating fish. They only eat fish because they have to. Anybody who catches fish, and eats a fish is considered a pervert. That's a perversion. And all of a sudden, Mort's false teeth almost fell out. And Chiappetta is like, so basically what you're saying is that the 75,000 or whatever the number of wranglers that we have here in the U.S., they're all perverts? And he says, yes, that is what I'm saying. And that made big news. But Chiappetta also had an outing, too, where him and his crew nearly drowned on one of their shows. And it ended up being... the whole show was captured on film, and there was one where they barely survived, but they called it the Saga of the Soggy River Rats, and it was one of his finer shows. But Michigan Outdoors, it still does exist today. There's a version of it hosted by a guy named Fred Trost, who was an intern on the original Michigan Outdoors, but it's not the same as what Mort and Jerry did. Rounding out the last couple shows here, you probably remember Bob Allison doing Bowling for Dollars, which was a cookie cutter show that came from Plaster Productions in Baltimore, Maryland. This was a show that each market got to franchise. But the great thing about Bowling for Dollars wasn't the bowling, it wasn't the prizes, because it was only $1 a pin. And you had to throw like 5 strikes to win the Corvette, and you had to throw, 3 strikes in a row to win the cash jackpot. Most people just wound up knocking down a couple of pins and got a spare and wound up with dinner for 2 at the Rooster Tail restaurant, which is what I always remember people winning. But it was those interviews that Bob Allison used to do that was the whole charm of the show. The contestants would come out, and we got, Joe from Grosse Pointe, come on out. And the person would come out of the little doors that were shaped like a giant bowling pin. They used to shoot this show over at the Thunderbolt Lanes in Allen Park. And, the person would come out, and then Bob would say, oh, where do you work? And, who did you bring with you? And then they show that shot of the audience, and everybody would wave. And then, who would you like to say hello to at home? And so he would, people would do that. And that's what they went on the show for, really. I mean, nobody really went on there. You didn't have great bowlers on there, but people went on there because, again, it was something local, and you got to hear about local things. It was a show that shared a lot of intimacy with our community. So when I say that the intimacy is gone now, when the local news comes out, it's usually something bad. This was a show that made you feel good and made you proud of where you were from. And lastly, we have At the Zoo. No book about Detroit television could be complete without Sonny Elliott and At the Zoo. And this was a show that really showcased the Detroit Zoo like no other outlet ever did. And this show was actually given to Sonny back in 1962 as a wedding present from Channel 4. He had just gotten married that year, and as a wedding present, they decided, we'll do this special, At the Zoo. And if it does well, we'll do another show. And of course it did well, so they did another show. And they said, well, maybe we'll do another show after that. And it just spawned into a whole series. But this was a show that told you anything and everything you ever wanted to know about the animals, because as Sonny says, there's so many things about the animals that we don't know. And it's just like, how fast do they run? What do they eat? How do they sleep? How long do they sleep? Do they hibernate? Things like that. You see them there with a chimp. They used to do chimp shows on there. Of course, that's something that the zoos have gotten away from now. They don't do chimp shows because of the treatment of the animals. And one of the things that would happen was, one of the stories that was told to me that I did put in the book, was about how after the winter, when the crew would come out and they would bring these chimps out, it was the first time that they saw people, and after many months, after the whole winter. So what would happen is, the monkeys would start acting crazy. They'd ride the bicycles right into a wall, things like that. So it's one of the things that has disappeared, and it's, I guess, in a lot of ways, better for the animals, but that was certainly one of the highlights of the show. But anyway, that's TV Land Detroit, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take them.